Hi, thoughtful Libra. As August 20 and 21 unfold, you may notice a quiet alertness around a relationship that has become harder to understand than you want to admit. Something about the connection may look peaceful from the outside, yet inside you a question has been gathering. When did keeping the peace begin to require you to keep setting yourself aside? Perhaps this involves family, a close friend, or someone whose place in your life once felt secure, but the imbalance has grown beyond one disagreement or disappointing exchange. You may have continued as though everything were fine, choosing your words carefully, giving people the benefit of the doubt, and trying to see every side before deciding how you truly felt. That ability to understand different perspectives is part of your emotional intelligence. But it becomes exhausting when everyone else's perspective receives a place at the table except your own. Beneath the polite conversations and carefully maintained peace, something in you may be asking to be acknowledged. The relationship may not have changed through one dramatic confrontation, but through small moments that quietly altered what you could trust. Perhaps a promise was made and slowly lost its meaning. Perhaps you were always the one reaching across the distance, explaining, forgiving, adjusting, or finding the words that allowed another difficult moment to pass. And perhaps what hurt most was noticing someone else, close enough to understand what was happening, yet unwilling to step toward fairness when you needed it. Their silence may not have looked like an attack, but silence can speak with surprising force when it comes from someone you believed would recognize when something was becoming unequal. This is not about turning your pain into a verdict against another person. It is about giving your emotional response the dignity of being real. You do not have to prove that someone intended to hurt you before you are allowed to acknowledge that a relationship has left you depleted. Sometimes healing begins more quietly than confrontation, by naming the imbalance honestly, without immediately explaining it away. For you, Libra, unfairness can be especially difficult to carry because you naturally search for context. You may wonder what the other person was going through, why they behaved as they did, whether you misunderstood their intentions, or whether speaking honestly would create more disruption than remaining silent. You may even convince yourself that preserving harmony is the kinder choice. But there is a difference between creating peace and absorbing the discomfort that other people refuse to face. And that difference may be becoming clearer now. Imagine spending so much emotional energy keeping a conversation open that you forget to notice whether anyone is actually listening to you. You make room for another person's feelings, soften your language, reconsider your position, and return to the table because some part of you still hopes mutual understanding will appear. Then one day, the exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. The deepest hurt may not come from losing the relationship itself, but from realizing how often you made yourself smaller just to keep the connection comfortable. That realization can change the way you experience trust. You may not become cold or closed off. Instead, you may become more attentive to reciprocity. You notice when reassuring words are not matched by actions, when an apology arrives only after you have already repaired the damage, or when support seems available only when you are the one offering it. These details may seem insignificant from the outside, but to you, they reveal whether the connection truly has room for two people. What others sometimes call your tendency to keep weighing every side may actually come from a sincere desire to be fair. You do not want to judge someone without understanding them, and you do not want anger to make decisions your calmer self might regret. But there comes a moment when endless consideration becomes another way of postponing your own truth. You can understand why someone behaved a certain way and still recognize that their behavior hurt you. Think of a room where every window is open, allowing everyone else's voice, mood, and perspective to move freely through the space. You have spent so long adjusting the atmosphere for everyone else that you may have forgotten to ask whether you can breathe comfortably there yourself. That is the subtle exhaustion this moment invites you to notice. Not because every difficult relationship must disappear, but because your own sense of fairness deserves a place in the conversation. There may also be a deeper wound underneath all of this, one that has less to do with the disagreement itself and more to do with being understood. You may have wondered whether asking for equal effort made you demanding, whether wanting consistency made you too sensitive, or whether expecting someone to meet you halfway meant you were asking for too much. Yet the ability to see another person's side should never require you to erase the side of the story that belongs to you. Perhaps you became quieter after what happened. To others, that quietness may have looked like forgiveness or a return to normal, but inside, you may know that some of your silence came from exhaustion rather than peace. You were tired of explaining what should have been obvious and tired of carrying the emotional work of trying to make two people meet in the middle when you were the only one still walking toward it. And as that realization settles, you may begin to see that protecting a relationship and protecting yourself do not always ask you to make the same choice. So you return to what you knew best, keeping things moving, smoothing over difficult moments, answering when people needed you, and doing your part to keep the relationship from falling apart. You stayed dependable, thoughtful, and composed, and because you continued functioning, others may have assumed the hurt was already behind you. But beneath that calm surface, there may still be a younger, more vulnerable part of you, holding one quiet question. Why did something you treated with such care receive so little care in return? You may have pushed that question beneath conversations, responsibilities, and the constant effort to understand everyone else's side until you could barely hear it yourself. Yet some deeper part of you never stopped noticing the imbalance and never completely accepted that you simply needed to be more patient. That is why this moment matters, Libra. This is not about condemning your family or turning an old relationship into a permanent verdict. It is about giving the part of you that kept making room for everyone else a chance to speak honestly. And remember what your pain does not say about you. It does not mean you are difficult, overly sensitive, or incapable of letting things go. It does not mean wanting fairness makes you demanding, or that caring about respect makes you incapable of compromise. Your sensitivity is connected to what allows a relationship to feel trustworthy: reciprocity, honesty, consistency, consideration, and the sense that both people matter within the same space. Your willingness to keep understanding people is not a flaw. It shows that you can hold more than one perspective while still searching for compassion. But perhaps that ability has sometimes come at a cost, because giving others room has become so natural that you rarely stop to ask how much room remains for you. You may have told yourself that no one meant to hurt you, that perhaps they were struggling, or that you were asking too much simply because you wanted their actions to match their words. You may even have questioned whether you were making too much of something others considered insignificant. That internal negotiation could have kept you quiet far longer than anyone realized. But understanding someone else's reasons cannot require you to erase your own experience. You can recognize their circumstances without turning those circumstances into an excuse for treating your needs as less important. Some people spend years carrying the emotional weight of a relationship without realizing how tired they have become. They listen, mediate, soften their words, make the first move, and think carefully about everyone else's reactions, while almost no one asks what all that effort is costing them. Think about that for a moment. Has someone ever sat beside you without needing anything from you, without asking you to solve another problem, and simply recognized how much emotional space you have been holding for everyone else? If that recognition has been missing, let yourself receive it here for a moment. You do not have to use this awareness to accuse anyone or rewrite your history overnight. Just allow yourself to breathe and admit that something mattered to you, because truth needs somewhere to exist before it can change the way you carry it. What you have felt deserves to be acknowledged without being softened into something more convenient for everyone around you. And as that recognition settles, another realization begins to surface, one that may be harder to face than the original disappointment. The imbalance may not have come only from the person who crossed a line or failed to meet you with the same care you offered. There may also have been someone nearby who saw enough to understand what was happening, yet chose not to disturb the peace by stepping into the middle of it. That quiet participation can be especially painful for you because silence is rarely just silence when fairness matters deeply to you. Someone may believe they are avoiding conflict, but their neutrality can leave the person already carrying the hurt feeling completely alone. They may say they never attacked you, never said anything cruel, and never directly caused the problem. Yet when you needed someone to acknowledge what was happening, their absence spoke in a language you could not easily ignore. Imagine realizing that someone you trusted, someone familiar enough with your heart to know what would hurt you, watched an imbalance unfold and decided that saying nothing was easier than standing for what was fair. Perhaps they were uncertain, afraid of becoming involved, or simply protecting their own comfort. Whatever their reason, you may still remember the feeling of looking toward them and realizing they were not going to meet you where you stood. Maybe that is why this kind of experience can linger. One person may create the wound, while another deepens it simply by refusing to acknowledge that the wound exists. In moments of reflection, people often discover that their strongest anger is not always reserved for the person who disappointed them, but for the person who understood enough to recognize the imbalance and still remained silent. There is a difficult truth inside that realization. You may eventually release your anger toward the person who directly hurt you, yet accepting the silence of someone who knew better can feel much harder. Consider the older woman whose family allowed damaging rumors about her character and financial decisions to circulate without defending what they knew to be true. They understood who she was, knew the integrity behind her choices, and still no one stepped forward. For her, the silence became more painful than the accusations, because an accusation can come from someone who does not know you. But when someone who does know you remains quiet, you may begin wondering whether the loyalty you offered ever carried the same weight in their heart that their loyalty carried in yours. And that question can stay with you long after the conversation itself has disappeared, quietly changing the way you understand what true reciprocity requires. Libra. This may touch something very old inside you, because you have often been taught, directly or indirectly, that keeping the peace is one of the highest forms of goodness. You have let things pass that you could have questioned, softened words that deserved to be spoken, and chosen understanding even when part of you was quietly asking to be understood in return. You have allowed uncomfortable moments to drift away because confrontation seemed more damaging than simply carrying the discomfort yourself. But there is something you are being asked to recognize now. Silence is not always neutral. Silence can become a choice that protects the person creating the imbalance. And sometimes the person who refuses to take a position ends up standing beside the very behavior that has been hurting you. As an air sign naturally attuned to perspective, communication, and the space between people, you may have learned to consider every side before allowing yourself to decide where you stand. There is something beautiful about that instinct, yet it can become a trap when everyone around you begins to believe that your ability to understand means you will tolerate anything. Harmony can slowly become an expectation that you will soften first, compromise longest, and speak last. You do not necessarily fear disagreement, Libra. What drains you is the emotional disorder that follows when people stop listening to one another, so you may sometimes choose to preserve the atmosphere around you even while an entirely different conversation is taking place inside your heart. And every time you choose that route, people who refuse to take responsibility can become increasingly comfortable, allowing you to absorb the emotional consequences. They begin to assume you will understand one more disappointment because you understood the previous one. They may interpret your patience as permission, your flexibility as endless availability, and your willingness to see both sides as proof that you will continue making room for their behavior. Yet something within you has reached the point where it cannot keep carrying an imbalance simply because you know how to make it look peaceful. God does not require noise in order to see what happened. Every effort you made to preserve connection was seen. Every conversation you entered with the intention of finding common ground was seen. Every quiet moment when someone else chose comfort over fairness was seen. And every time you felt yourself becoming smaller just to keep the relationship calm was seen. Nothing needs to be hidden from him, and nobody can reshape the truth simply by refusing to acknowledge it. You are not being asked to retaliate or make another person suffer because you suffered. Revenge is not what will restore your peace. What matters is recognizing that a relationship you once experienced as mutual may not have been as balanced as you believed. Once you can see that clearly, you can begin loosening your attachment to the version of the relationship you hoped would exist, without allowing resentment to become another emotional responsibility. Think about the gatherings, conversations, and familiar moments you have shared. And ask yourself how often you walked away feeling less like an equal participant and more like the person responsible for keeping everyone comfortable. How often did people notice what you could understand before they noticed how tired you were? How often did you listen carefully to someone else's perspective, only to realize that your own feelings had never truly been given the same attention? How many times did you leave a conversation emotionally exhausted while nobody thought to ask what had been happening inside you? Your deeper self may have recognized this pattern long before you were ready to say it aloud. Naming it felt dangerous because you feared that honesty might cost you whatever connection remained. You may have worried that if you finally objected, they would call you difficult, overly sensitive, or unwilling to compromise. You may even have feared being described as selfish simply because you cared about fairness, mutual effort, respect, and emotional reciprocity. So you continued negotiating against your own feelings, telling yourself that preserving the relationship was more important than admitting what the relationship had gradually become. But this moment asks something different from you. It asks for honesty without hostility. It asks you to name the experience without turning it into a weapon. Someone helped make this imbalance possible through their silence, and recognizing that reality does not mean you must continue accepting it. Perhaps nobody has ever given you permission to say this clearly, so hear it now. Standing by while you were being treated unfairly was not harmless. Choosing silence when acknowledgement or support was needed still had an effect. You are not required to keep carrying the emotional consequences of another person's refusal to participate honestly in the relationship. For far too long, the feeling of being undervalued may have followed you into ordinary moments. It sat quietly beside you during conversations, lingered after unanswered messages, and returned whenever you offered understanding again, even though something inside you was asking whether the effort was still mutual. Each time you may have told yourself that compassion was simply part of who you were, while another part of you remembered how rarely that same consideration seemed to come back toward you. You can begin placing that burden down here, in a space where acknowledging reality is not an act of attack, but an act of self-respect. You do not need to punish anyone in order to free yourself. You only need to stop arguing with what your own heart has already noticed, and once you do, another question naturally rises from beneath everything you have carried. Why were you the one who kept trying to hold the relationship together? Somewhere beneath the memories you have replayed in quiet moments, there is another layer of understanding waiting to emerge, and seeing it clearly may change the way you interpret everything that happened. You have probably asked yourself more times than you can remember what you did wrong. You searched through your own behavior as though the explanation had to be hidden somewhere inside your mistakes. You reconsidered the boundaries you expressed, wondered whether you were too firm, and questioned whether expecting equal effort somehow made you too demanding. Perhaps you responded by becoming even more accommodating. Perhaps you softened boundaries that once helped you feel emotionally safe. Perhaps you tried to become easier to understand, easier to please, and more willing to compromise, hoping that giving a little more would restore the closeness you once felt. Yet something painful happened instead. The more emotional space you created for them, the more they seemed willing to occupy, until generosity stopped feeling like mutual care and started feeling like an expectation. That pattern left you facing the same question again. Why? The answer you are being invited to consider is not necessarily that they hated you. Their response may have been connected to something more complicated. You represented a level of awareness they were not ready to meet. You noticed patterns they preferred to leave unnamed, asked for reciprocity where they were comfortable with convenience, and valued honesty even when honesty made the relationship less comfortable. You did not fail by being who you were. You simply began asking for a kind of mutuality that exposed how uneven the relationship had become. You moved through life with a willingness to consider consequences rather than simply reacting to whatever emotion filled the room. You believed that values mattered even when honoring them required difficult conversations. You tried to create boundaries while other people were still negotiating theirs, and you searched for consistency while others accepted whatever arrangement caused the least immediate discomfort. Without intending to, your way of relating became a mirror placed between you and them. When they looked at you, they could also see the compromises they had avoided, the conversations they had postponed, and the imbalance they had learned to live with. That reflection was uncomfortable, and understanding why it became so uncomfortable is where the next layer of this truth begins to reveal itself. When people are unwilling to face what their own behavior reveals, they sometimes turn their discomfort toward the person who reflects it back to them. I remember a woman who once described herself as the different one in her family because she was always the person trying to understand both sides, choosing her words carefully and refusing to participate in unnecessary drama. They called her overly sensitive, difficult, and too concerned with keeping things fair, when in reality she was simply trying to live according to values that mattered deeply to her. Libra, there is something important about the way you experience relationships. You can sense when the emotional atmosphere has shifted long before anyone admits that something is wrong. You notice the pause before an answer, the change in someone's tone, the conversation that suddenly becomes one-sided, and the subtle moment when compromise stops being mutual. You may have been born with a strong instinct for connection, but that does not mean you were meant to keep every relationship balanced by yourself. Sometimes your greatest lesson is learning that harmony created through your constant adjustment is not the same thing as genuine peace. You may have spent a long time wondering whether you were simply asking for too much. Perhaps you questioned your own reactions because you could understand the other person's perspective so easily. You could see their history, their fears, their excuses, and all the reasons they might have behaved as they did, while your own hurt remained quietly waiting for someone to consider it. You may have spoken less, softened your boundaries, and tried to make yourself easier to be around, only to discover that the more you accommodated, the more natural it became for others to expect you to carry the emotional weight. That is why the labels placed upon you were never the whole truth. Being thoughtful does not mean you are weak, and wanting fairness does not make you demanding. Caring about peace does not mean you should have to swallow every uncomfortable truth just to keep another person comfortable. As always 20 and 21 unfold, Libra, you may find yourself seeing this distinction with greater clarity. Understanding someone else's reasons does not require you to abandon your own experience. You spent enough time trying to fit yourself into relationships where your needs were treated as negotiable, while everyone else's were treated as important. You do not have to keep over-explaining what hurt you simply because another person refuses to understand it. You do not have to keep doing the emotional work for two people in order to prove that you care. There is another way to create peace, and it begins when you stop asking yourself to disappear just so the relationship can remain comfortable. After everything that has happened, what did you choose? You did not have to become cruel, and you did not need to retaliate against anyone who disappointed you. Instead, you began turning your attention back toward your own inner world, quietly rebuilding your sense of worth in the places where it had been worn thin. That shift matters, because there is a truth you may have known for a long time, even while your heart resisted accepting it. Some people may never offer the apology you have been waiting to receive. It is not necessarily because they had no idea that they hurt you. Sometimes a person avoids an apology because acknowledging what they did would require them to look honestly at themselves, and that kind of self-examination can be uncomfortable. You may have waited, hoping that one day they would finally recognize how much you gave, how often you compromised, and how deeply their choices affected you. But eventually you begin to understand that your healing cannot remain suspended while another person decides whether they are ready to become accountable. Dear Libra, one of your greatest strengths is your ability to keep searching for a peaceful path, even after something has fractured your trust. Yet that same strength can become painful when you keep waiting for another person to meet you halfway. You may tell yourself that if you explain things one more time, listen a little longer, or give them another opportunity to understand, the relationship might finally return to what it was. But waiting in that emotional doorway can become one of the loneliest forms of exhaustion, especially when you are the only one still standing there. Forgiveness can offer another kind of freedom, not because what happened was acceptable, and not because the relationship must return to what it was. It can simply mean that you are no longer willing to let someone else's choices occupy so much space inside your mind and heart. Think of a window that has remained closed because the room became too heavy. Opening it does not erase what happened inside, but it allows fresh air to enter and reminds you that the room is larger than the pain it once held. So ask yourself gently, do I deserve peace of mind? You do not need to answer that question while defending the person who hurt you, nor do you need to convince yourself that everything is fine. You can acknowledge the disappointment, honor the part of you that still aches, and begin loosening the invisible thread that keeps pulling you back toward a relationship that no longer offers the reciprocity you need. Letting go is not about deciding that they deserve forgiveness. It is about recognizing that you deserve to stop carrying what was never yours to carry. You have walked far enough with this wound through quiet nights, difficult conversations, and moments when you wanted to speak but chose silence because you were afraid honesty might destroy what remained. Now you are allowed to pause without waiting for someone else to return with the words you hoped to hear. You can create enough inner space to breathe again, enough distance to see the relationship clearly, and enough self-respect to recognize that peace does not require you to keep negotiating against yourself. Have you ever wondered, if I let go, will I lose them forever? Perhaps what you are really being asked to release is not the person, but the expectation that they will eventually become capable of giving you the relationship you kept hoping for. You are not erasing the history you shared. You are releasing the version of the connection that depended on you continually, adjusting yourself to keep it alive. You deserve relationships where consideration moves in both directions, where listening is not something only you provide, and where love does not require you to silence the truth inside yourself. You do not need another person to change before you are allowed to choose differently. As you move through August 20 and 21, let that realization settle gently. Your next step does not have to be dramatic, and it does not have to be dramatic, and it does not have to be driven by anger. It can simply begin with choosing not to abandon yourself again, even as the old patterns continue asking for your attention. Dear Libra, sit quietly with yourself for a moment and ask, did I really lose them? Or did I finally release a relationship that no longer knew how to meet me with the same care I was giving? There is an important difference between being alone and being free from a connection that constantly asked you to compromise your own truth. You may discover that the space left behind is not as empty as you once feared, because healthier forms of belonging can begin to enter when you stop trying to make an unequal relationship feel balanced. Some people may call themselves family because of blood, history, or shared memories, yet never pause to ask whether you are tired, whether you need support, or whether you feel appreciated. Then there are people you have never met, people who may enter your life without any obligation to do so, and somehow recognize the parts of you that others overlooked. They sit beside you without immediately asking what you can offer, and the connection feels different because you are not constantly measuring your words, adjusting your needs, or wondering whether the peace between you depends entirely on your willingness to bend. Dear Libra, you are deeply attuned to the space between people. You notice when a conversation becomes uneven, when affection stops moving both ways, and when you are giving understanding far more often than you are receiving it. You do not need empty praise or crowded rooms simply to feel connected. What you long for is a relationship spacious enough for you to breathe, speak honestly, and remain yourself without having to monitor every emotional shift around you. The wisdom of your sign is not merely about keeping things pleasant. It is about learning what genuine harmony feels like when both people are allowed to matter. Because of that, the relationships that truly nourish you may not always be the ones you expected to keep forever. You may gradually step away from an old circle where you were constantly smoothing tension, translating feelings, making compromises, and trying to keep everyone comfortable. And as you create that distance, you may begin noticing something beautiful. Connection does not have to be earned through emotional labor. Sometimes it arrives through a simple gesture, a conversation that feels effortless, or someone remembering what matters to you without being asked. Imagine someone who has spent years surrounded by family conflict and eventually chooses a quieter life. A neighbor they have known for only a short time begins stopping by with a warm loaf of bread, sharing a few minutes of conversation simply because they care. There is no shared history demanding loyalty, no old obligation holding the gesture together. And yet that small act can carry more tenderness than years of complicated family expectations. Sometimes belonging reveals itself through what people freely give when they have nothing to gain. Family is not supposed to be a place where you must remain silent to preserve the atmosphere. It is not a relationship where you constantly clean up emotional messes, soften every truth, or make yourself smaller so someone else can remain comfortable. Family, in its healthiest form, is where you can finally exhale and discover that your breath does not disturb anyone. It is where care moves in both directions, where your presence is valued rather than merely accommodated, and where you do not have to negotiate your right to be treated with respect. You have never been as alone as that old relationship may have made you feel. Perhaps you simply spent too long looking for belonging in places where you were expected to perform a role instead of being fully yourself. Your identity is not difficult, demanding, overly sensitive, or impossible to please. You are someone who wants connection to feel honest, balanced, and alive. Someone who believes that understanding should travel in both directions and that love becomes stronger when neither person has to disappear inside it. There is a door opening, but perhaps it is not about someone else arriving to rescue you. It may be the door through which you finally step out of the emotional room where you have been negotiating your worth for far too long. You may have once thought, if I stop holding everything together, who will keep this relationship alive? You do not have to carry that responsibility forever. What becomes possible now is a different kind of connection, one where you can be valued without first proving how much you are willing to give. Are you ready to receive relationships that do not require you to abandon yourself in order to belong? The answer does not have to arrive all at once. As August 20 and 21-26 invite you to look more honestly at the connections surrounding you. Allow yourself to notice where your energy feels returned and where it seems to disappear, because that awareness can quietly change what you are willing to participate in from here. Dear Libra, you have lived through experiences that other people may never completely understand, but your heart remembers what they taught you. If someone from the past ever returns with genuine respect, you will not need to force the old bond back into place. You will recognize the difference between words that sound peaceful and behavior that actually creates peace. And whether that relationship changes or simply remains part of your history, you can keep moving toward connections where you are met with the same openness, consideration, and care that you have spent so much of your life offering others.